The heat in the Ohio country was a heavy, physical thing in July of 1755. It wasn't just the sun. It was the humidity that clung to the red wool coats of the British regulars, turning their uniforms into sodden, itchy weights that chafed against their sunburnt necks. Imagine the sound of it. 2,000 pairs of heavy boots thumping against the dirt, the rhythmic clinking of brass canteens, and the incessant, rhythmic thud of axes. General Edward Braddock had a vision. He wasn't just moving an army. He was carving a civilization into the primitive wilderness. He had his men hacking a 12-foot wide road through the ancient, untouched forest of the Monongahela. To Braddock, the woods were just an obstacle, a messy inconvenience that delayed his inevitable victory over the French at Fort Duquesne. He believed in the power of the line. He believed in the thunder of the volley. He believed that no force of savages or backwoods Frenchmen could stand against the disciplined, cold steel of the British Empire. But the forest was listening. Among the ranks walked a young, tall Virginian, a man who had already tasted defeat in these woods just a year prior. George Washington rode near the back, his body racked with a fever so intense he had to cushion his saddle with pillows just to stay upright. He watched the red line stretch out for nearly a mile, a thin, bright ribbon of blood-colored cloth, vulnerable to the shadows. He had warned Braddock. He'd whispered that the woods don't play by European rules, but Braddock had simply laughed, dismissing the concerns of a mere provincial officer. In Braddock's world, war was a game played on open fields with a polite exchange of lead. By noon on July 9th, the army reached the Monongahela River. The crossing was a spectacle of imperial pride. The sun glinted off the polished bayonets, and the water splashed against the legs of the horses as the vanguard pushed across. They were only 7 miles from their target. The men began to cheer, thinking the hard part was over. The woods here were thinner, the ground rising into a series of gentle ravines. If this story of forgotten frontier survival is hitting home for you, smash that like button and subscribe. We bring these moments of history back to life every single week. Now, let's get back to the shadows. It happened in a heartbeat. At the head of the column, Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Gage saw something move. A man, dressed in a fringed hunting shirt and wearing a silver gorget that caught the light, suddenly appeared in the middle of the path. It was the French commander, Beaujeu. He stopped, looked at the massive British column, and then turned to the woods on either side, waving his hat. A single, haunting whoop pierced the air, then another, and then the world exploded. It wasn't a volley. It was a chaotic, rattling crescendo of musket fire coming from everywhere and nowhere. The French and their indigenous allies didn't form lines. They melted into the ravines. They disappeared behind the thick trunks of ancient oaks. The British regulars, trained to fire at a visible enemy, found themselves shooting at ghosts. They stood in their neat, perfect rows, shoulder to shoulder, and they died in neat, perfect rows. The smoke from the black powder began to settle in the hollows of the hills, thick and acrid, blinding the men. The smell was overwhelming, the sulfurous bite of gunpowder mixed with the metallic tang of fresh blood and the earthy scent of churned-up mud. The regulars tried to return fire, but they were aiming at puffs of smoke in the undergrowth. Every time a redcoat fell, another stepped up to fill the gap, only to be cut down by a marksman he couldn't see. General Braddock charged into the fray, his face purple with rage. "Stand your ground! Form your platoons!" he screamed, his voice cracking over the roar of the musketry. He didn't understand. He saw his men breaking, turning to flee, and he began to beat them with the flat of his sword, forcing them back into the killing zone. To Braddock, a retreat was a dishonor worse than death, but the men were being slaughtered. They were huddling together in small groups, terrified, their eyes wide and white, becoming even larger targets for the hidden snipers. George Washington, despite his fever, threw himself into the chaos. He was everywhere at once. He saw a horse go down, felt the jarring thud as he hit the ground, and immediately scrambled onto another. He felt the tugs on his coat. 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 separate musket balls tore through his clothing, missing his flesh by mere inches. 2 horses were killed under him. He was a man possessed, trying to organize some kind of defense, shouting orders that were lost in the screams of the dying. The British provincials, the men from Virginia and the colonies, knew what to do. They broke ranks and dove for the trees, trying to fight the enemy on their own terms. But when the British regulars saw men in civilian-style clothes firing from behind logs, they panicked. In the blinding smoke and terror, the regulars began firing at the provincials. It was a nightmare of friendly fire. Men were being shot in the back by their own brothers, while the hidden enemy picked off the officers one by one. Then came the moment that ended the British hope. General Braddock, still mounted and still screaming, felt a sudden, massive impact in his side. A musket ball had torn through his arm and buried itself deep in his lung. He slumped in the saddle, the fire leaving his eyes as he collapsed. With the general down, the last shred of discipline vanished. It wasn't a retreat, it was a rout. The most professional army in the world turned and ran. They threw away their muskets. They abandoned their heavy packs. They left the wounded screaming on the forest floor as they sprinted back toward the river. The Indigenous warriors emerged from the shadows then, their knives glinting in the dappled sunlight. The slaughter that followed was the stuff of nightmares. Washington and a few remaining officers managed to get Braddock into a cart. The general was gasping, his breath bubbling through the blood in his chest. He looked up at Washington, his voice a mere whisper, and muttered, "Who would have thought it?" They retreated through the night, a broken, bleeding line of men fleeing through the dark woods they had tried to conquer. The road they had spent weeks building was now a path of death. Braddock died 4 days later. They buried him in the middle of that very road, right in the center of the track, and then they drove the wagons and horses over his grave. They did it to hide him. They feared that if the enemy found his body, they would desecrate it. Years later, when the road was expanded, they found his bones. But on that night in 1755, the only thing left was the silence of the forest and the knowledge that the wilderness had won. The British Empire had been humbled by the trees, by the shadows, and by a young Virginian who walked away with 4 bullet holes in his coat and a very different understanding of what it meant to survive. The Monongahela didn't just take lives that day. It took the myth of invincibility. And as the sun set over the Ohio country, the red wool was finally starting to dry, stained forever by the earth it had tried to claim.